Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday. It is not March 12th, it is February 12th. I must be really excited to just get February over with. We are going to hear the presentation, The Shame of Chicago, the color tax screening. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can again just type those in that chat box and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. So thanks to all those participating chapters and divisions for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the APA Housing and Community Development Division. So thanks to you for bringing this super important topic to light here. We're very excited for today's session. This session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing, and you can log those credits by heading over to planning.org, logging into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, which is ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And to that, we have a new website. For those of you that have joined us already this year, you've heard me saying that we're launching a new website soon. Well, it's here, so be sure to check it out. It's super user-friendly. We have all of our sessions listed for you to register, and all of our past webcast information is nice and tidy, so you can download PDF copies of the slide decks, and it links directly to a recording of the session. So be sure to head over to our webcast webpage and check it out. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to get up-to-date information on all of our sessions. And also be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's where we post recordings of all of our sessions. And this is so funny because I was just telling our presenters that sometimes the toddler or even the 4-month-old make debuts, and here we have them right here. Anyway, so that's it. That is the end of my housekeeping items. Make sure that you type those questions in the chat box if you have them. And I think that's it. So I am going to turn it over to Angela, who is going to kind of introduce our speakers and today's session. Angela.
Great, thank you. I was hoping you were going to introduce us to our special guest. Good afternoon. I am Angela Brooks. I am an at-large board member for the American Planning Association, as well as the immediate past chair of the APA Housing and Community Development Division. This year, the division is broadening our scope, and we're trying to provide more programming on housing and community development issues that have larger impacts on the planning community. Today, we're excited to host a screening of episode 3 in the documentary series, The Shame of Chicago. Today's episode is The Color Tax. The Color Tax tells a story of how a system of predatory home contract sales during the 50s and 60s really kind of did a transition of wealth for Black families in home ownership. For those of you who are not familiar with land contracts, you'll get a very good education today. Essentially in the 1930s through probably about the 60s, it's how most middle American African Americans were able to purchase homes. Systematic racism of the FHA. Government hadn't deemed Black neighborhoods worthy of being eligible for federal mortgage insurance, which is how mortgages were deemed or able to be somewhat affordable. As we as planners kind of look at systems and racism and how they've impacted communities, it definitely is a sign of why some communities aren't very trustful of the work we do. So we thought this would be a really important topic for us to kind of kick off our series and education about kind of policies that we're up against as planners. Before I turn it on over, I will just note that for those of you who aren't familiar with this, just be prepared to go through a series of emotions as you watch this film. And when we get on the other side, we'll have a conversation. We certainly encourage you to use the chat feature. We are joined by the film's producer, Bruce Ornston, who will give us a lot of background behind how he came to do this series and what else he's up to. And then for those of you who are not familiar with the infamous Dan Lauber, former AICP president, but also a planner and lawyer who's dedicated his career to addressing fair housing issues. And he can give us a lot of background about the stuff he's doing, not just in the Illinois area in Oak Park, but some of the overarching policy issues that we all should be aware of. So we will see you on the other side of the documentary.
Blows you away. I grew up during this era in South Shore in Chicago during the period where it went from integrating to resegregating, and was aware of this to a small extent. I learned a lot from this, Bruce. Thank you for doing it. What scares the heck out of me is that the discrimination against Blacks in particular in the mortgage market continues to this very day. And we've discovered that we did analyses of impediments to fair housing choice for about 10 years. And we found inevitably in every jurisdiction, this ranges from Houston to Clark County, Nevada, to Lakewood, Ohio, to Naperville, Illinois, Lake County, Illinois, Fairfax County, Virginia, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Washington, D.C. We found in every instance that African Americans were getting mortgages at a much lower rate than any other group. So for example, in the District of Columbia, mortgage applications by Blacks of any income, including those in the highest income brackets, were approved less frequently in 2010 than applications from non-Hispanic Caucasians in the lowest income bracket. In other words, the poorest whites were able to get mortgages at a higher rate than the wealthiest Blacks. And and the rate for the highest income Blacks was lower than the rate for non-Hispanic whites in the lowest income bracket in 2009 as well. And people who object to say, well, that's because the African Americans, they have poor credit histories, et cetera. Well, we looked at the reasons for the denials, and there was no difference, no pattern. So the only conclusion we conceivably could have was discrimination. And we found this consistently. And then what also blew me away is that high cost loans are much more prevalent, have been much more prevalent among Blacks than any other group. These are the high cost mortgages that are also called subprime and predatory. They have higher rates. They typically 3 or more percentage points above the normal rates. They get variable interest rates that can skyrocket years after the loan is issued. And we consistently found, going through the data, that like in Washington, D.C., which is pretty typical, first 20% of these result in foreclosure, which is 8 times the rate of normal loans falling into foreclosure. But in D.C., in 2006, 40% of the mortgages to Black households were high-cost mortgages, 3 times the rates for whites, Asians, and 4 times the rate of Hispanics. By 2008 and 2009, the proportion of loans that were high cost had declined significantly, but it was still more than twice as frequent for Blacks as any other group. So, what got started in the era that Bruce reported on in the film, it's continued in different forms. And it's just startling how, I guess this is what we would call institutional racism. And people just seem to be, white people in particular, who are the ones that produce segregation and discrimination more than any other group, seem to be totally unaware of this.
Yeah, this is Bruce will tell you. Bruce and I have done this before, and I feel something different every time I see this, Bruce. It's less emotional this time, so I actually was able to take notes, so I'm just as angry. But it's just so interesting, and I appreciate the time that you all took to list the names, because those are names we still hear in Chicago, and I'm sure that applies in every other city. And I'm just speechless every time because it just has it takes on different forms, as Dan mentioned. I know here in the Chicago area, there's a planning firm, Tesca and Associates. They did a study on commercial redlining. There are predominantly African-American affluent neighborhoods in the south suburbs of Chicago that are unable to attract commercial retailers, but for demographics, they have the numbers, but they can't attract really great retailers. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, in another very affluent suburb that is not very diverse, they can get whomever they want. So it's just startling to see how much things change, how much they remain the same. And Bruce, if maybe you can talk a little bit about, kind of what sparked you to do this and kind of a little background on that. I actually did order Mark Salter's daughter's book, Family Property, so that's next on my reading list. So this has definitely encouraged me to dig a little bit deeper, and thank you. But just to give us a little background on that.
Okay, thanks, Angela, and thank you, Christine, and everybody at the APA. This is really I appreciate the opportunity to speak to planners all over the country. We've done presentations to the City Housing Department in Chicago, and we're going to do one with the county assessor staff and others. But this is just a terrific audience. I don't know if you have a chat section where people can, comment, but I'm sure there's a lot of great stories out there from especially the older planners and maybe some of the younger ones who really know their history. Would love to hear about other stories in other cities and make the connection as we move forward in the series. So any kind of reactions in your chat section would be much appreciated. I was motivated to do this because my background is in community organizing, actually. I was a community organizer for about 15 years throughout the late 70s and into the 1980s, and only got into producing film as a result of community organizing. In that, we worked on issues of affordable housing, trying to get affordable housing in low-income communities, improve our schools, create more job opportunities for people. The more that I learned about what I was doing as a community organizer and trying to, kind of put a tourniquet on all the bleeding that was taking place in these neighborhoods, economic and emotional bleeding, the more I learned about whence we came from, right? And that, drew my interest into looking at this history of housing segregation in Chicago, which, pretty much represents, it's a stand-in for what happened in Cleveland and Milwaukee and Detroit and Baltimore and so on. So I thought that, this is background that's valuable to informing us today about, how, we ended up with a racial wealth gap. It's certainly not the whole story, but it's a good part of the story. And I thought that this would be a real valuable kind of tool, an educational tool for everybody, especially young people. I teach at Duke University as well as doing production work. And my students, even though, Duke's pretty exclusive kind of school, the wealthy ones, the poor one, or the ones that come from lower income families, whether black or white, they don't know anything about the struggle in cities, the civil rights struggle in cities that took place across the country. They know a little bit about the South. And so I thought this would be very valuable as we go forward. And that's, what's motivated me to tell this story. And it's in the context of a larger series that we're producing that will cover the whole history of housing segregation in Chicago.
You're muted, my dear. While you unmute yourself real quickly.
You're kidding me?
No, not you. No. Breathe. Not you.
You would have let me know. That's right.
Yeah, I would have. Real quickly, the people want to know how they can view the rest of the series. How can they get a hold of it?
they'll get a hold of it when I complete it. I'm in the middle of production right now. We were going gangbusters, and then the pandemic hit. And so many of the people, well, first off, I'm in Durham. I don't want to travel to Chicago. There's other people to interview in New York that have moved from Chicago to New York or wherever you have. And there's a number of older people that are really, isolating themselves right now, quarantining themselves. So, I hope to, maybe around the summer start to get back to production. We've got a great production team. And a great advisory team of some of the best scholars in the country who've studied this work. So it's just really taking their stories and or what they've written and their scholarship and kind of bringing it to life. So I hope maybe in about 16 months we'll have the completed series, and that'll be airing on television. We're going to make it free. It's going to be a little bit different, that you're not going to have to go on Netflix and pay your monthly bill, or you're not going to have to go on a website and pay $9.95 to watch it. We're going to put it up on a website free. So we're in the middle of production, and
Okay.
if any planners out there know of any large foundations who would like to support this work, that's helpful too. So I'll make that pitch.
And now this is episode 3 that we just viewed, correct?
Yeah, I jumped in the middle because there were some older people who were in the film, and I didn't want to waste any more time in getting to them. And as it turns out, Jack McNamara, the young priest who started the whole Contract Buyers League, passed away a few months ago. So yeah.
So essentially you're doing what George Lucas did with Star Wars. Started in the middle.
That's where I went with that.
You want to draw that parallel.
And Dan, I do want to kind of turn this to you, because you are both a planner and a lawyer, but you also included some really great handouts. And if you can kind of talk about the history during the Eisenhower administration in terms of systematic racism, which ties into the handout that I'm guessing you gave us.
Yeah, so, and to that, before Dan, you start thinking, folks, in your GoToWebinar tool panel, you'll see that there is a handouts tab, and within that are 2 handouts that Dan has provided. So you'll be able to download those. If you have issues, just let me know and I can send them to you directly. Okay, go ahead, Dan.
Well, this actually really started well before the Eisenhower era. And if anyone here who really wants to know how segregation got forced upon us by all levels of government, if you haven't already read it, you should get a hold of Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It's an extraordinarily well-written, citations like crazy. Looks like you have the paperback that doesn't have the error that was in the hardcover. Got the year wrong for, there's a picture in the book of a mob attacking a house where a black family had recently moved in, I think in New Jersey. And he referred to the year, but one of his readers, who's very astute, it must be a car nut, contacted him and let him know it can't be that year because the car that's in the picture, I think it was at Edsel, wasn't produced yet.
Wow.
So he fixed it in the paperback. He's very serious about being accurate, which is why I think it took him 5 years to get the book done. So this all started way back then, and it's been a partnership really between the federal government, state and local governments, and the real estate industry. So back in the 30s, the Roosevelt administration, quite candidly, was filled with a lot of white supremacists, as have a great many of our federal administrations, but Roosevelt was really filled with a lot of white supremacists and anti-Semites. And the FHA was basically refusing to give loans to blacks. They were actually, in some instances, he pointed out how redevelopment resulted in the destruction of integrated neighborhoods and the reconstruction of those neighborhoods with high rises, which would be segregated, one for blacks and one for whites. It marched on in partnership, and to give you an idea how bad it was against the code of ethics of the National Association of Realtors to introduce someone of a different race to a neighborhood. That didn't get lifted until the mid-1970s. The books that appraisers use, that they were taught how to do appraisals based on good old Homer Hoyt, were, and you may remember Homer Hoyt from your planning school classes, I don't know. They were basically saying that the lowest appraisals should be done in Black neighborhoods. The second lowest were Jewish neighborhoods. It was unreal. Racial steering was very common, and it actually still is. And that's the key in a certain sense, because whites were being steered to all white communities and away from integrated communities. Blacks were being steered to all Black communities and to integrated communities. So if you cut off whites from moving into an integrated community, it will inevitably resegregate. There's no choice. That's what's going to happen. It's a total manipulation of the market. They engaged in such things as blockbusting. I remember the phone calls I got as a teenager. I can still picture the foyer where I got the calls on our rotary dialed phone, saying there's a colored family moved in down the block. They're having barbecues on the front lawn and throwing watermelon pits and corn and cob all over the place. Plus, they're not kosher; they're eating pigs. I just added that one. It was shocking, stunning, and my parents weren't. They still kept putting money into the house in the mid '60s while people started moving away. But what's real important to know with South Shore in Chicago, there was never, and it illustrates the point I was making, there was never a white flight. A fellow named Harvey Molach did a book, Managed Integration Dilemmas of Doing Good in the City, based on his PhD thesis and his New York Times Magazine article, where he found the turnover rate in South Shore during this period was the same rate as in West Rogers Park, the most comparable other community in the Chicago area. What happened though is that 90% of the people moving into South Shore were Black. And one portion of South Shore, north of 71st Street, east of Stony Island, the landlords stopped renting to Blacks. It was all 3 flats. They stopped renting to whites, just would not renew the leases, and instead rented to African Americans who were willing to pay a higher rent to get out of the racial ghetto they were in. And the landlords also started doing deferred maintenance because they could get away with it, because the people moving in were so used to landlords that were doing that. That helped accelerate the change. So one of the key things, there's a lot that planners can do, and I can stop now and get into this later, but there's a lot that planners can do to counteract these practices, plus the practices of the government. One other practice of government that was so amazing that Rothstein points out, when Levittown was built, and every planner knows of Levittown, the developer could not get financing from the feds unless he agreed not to sell to Blacks. So while there were lots of African Americans working on building the place, they could not move there, and that contributes to the wealth gap that Bruce explained, because these were homes being sold for $7,000. They went up in value quite a bit. Now they're a couple $100,000, but no African American could enjoy that. Who could afford it could enjoy it, and that's been something that's been replayed over and over again, and it's very frustrating. And I'll just finish this by, I'll get into things planners can do later if you'd like, but
Definitely.
the important thing we got to remember is ending the American apartheid that we have. Because let's face it, as pointed out in Doug Massey's book, the levels of segregation here are as intense as in South Africa under apartheid. Ending this, achieving genuine integration where African Americans can enjoy the full fruits of their efforts, fully participate in the American dream, is going to take many generations. And one of the great lies we've had in the civil rights movement is we're going to integration now. It's going to happen now. In terms of housing, it's going to have to be over a long period of time, simply because of the nature of housing. People they've got a lot of different reasons they move. moving to achieve racial equity, integration is not real high on a lot of people's, very many people's priorities. But with the turnover of people with mortgages and such, the average mortgage is at least 12 years, it's going to be slow. But it's improving, but nowhere near where it ought to be. And we've got a long way to go. And it's not going to be changed by wishing people to just have a change of heart, because segregation was produced by deliberate action by the federal government, the state governments and local governments, and the real estate industry. And all of them have to change their practices and do things to overcome their past practices so we can make some real progress here. Otherwise, the wealth gap is going to continue forever because, as the film pointed out, your home is your greatest source of wealth. And that explains that huge difference in household wealth between whites and blacks.
If I can
Go ahead, Bruce.
just jump in and thanks, Stan. That was really comprehensive and clear. I'm going to dig back just a little bit before the FHA, federal government, in the 1930s developed these redlining maps. And here's another book for people to read, since we're talking to people who really want to delve into things. It is about Chicago. It covers 1890 to 1920. So what preceded these decisions for the federal government to restrict development in certain places and encourage it in other places? And there's the Great Migration that we're all familiar with that takes place in the first part of the 20th century. And as blacks were moving north to all the cities that we're living in, and as their populations increased, the segregation did not, I mean, it existed in some cities to some extent, but in Chicago, for example, most of the black families lived not in highly segregated communities. But as they came up north, there were a few white communities, more wealthy communities, that really objected to black people living in their communities, even if those black people were doctors and lawyers and other people that can certainly afford to live in those communities. And as one community by the University of Chicago on the south side, called the Hyde Park community, in 1908 they formed a protective club. And in that protective club, basically what they did is they organized the community to try to resist selling to any black home buyer. And any white realtor that would try to sell to a black person, and this is where you get into the steering issue, is that the Hyde Park, they would get blackballed. They would say, you're not going to do business in our community anymore if you sell to a black homeowner. And so as these years kind of rolled on, and you have to understand that also during these times, this is not too far away from the Civil War. There's a lot of people alive who had grown up in slavery, and the attitudes in the country, as abhorrent as they are right now, the racial attitudes, you just can't imagine how abhorrent they were back then, with all these those theories about race and the superiority of whites over blacks. So they got the real estate industry to adopt an ethical standard that then gets kind of baked into their whole way of licensing. And it came to the point, if you sold back in those days, if you were a realtor and you tried to sell a house to a black family in a white community, you can lose your real estate license. So there were communities in Baltimore who were drawing up segregation ordinances, saying, this section will have blacks, and this section we're going to have whites, and that's the way the law is going to define it. And those got thrown out of court. And then they looked to Chicago, and Chicago's realtors had something called restrictive covenants, and that's what you were referring to. That took place also in Levittown, is that you had restrictive covenants that were put in the deeds of homes, and then whites were not even allowed to sell to black people if they had one of these restrictive covenants in those deeds. So that further solidified the color line. And then you get to the 1930s, and who does the federal government look to implement this new home ownership program and policy that they have? They look to the realtors, the realtors who established the color line. And that's when they drew up the maps, as Dan described. So, you know, the history is long and deep, and you can see how racial attitudes kind of combined with or influence practices, and racial attitudes influence practices in private practice and in government, that then created this kind of scaffolding of racial segregation that exists in our cities today.
To echo what Bruce said, I just have a quote here from the 1938, the FHA's underwriting manual stated, and this is an exact quote: "If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes." And consistent with that, it was a requirement to get FHA insured financing, restrictive covenants prohibiting non-whites from moving in. All this stuff is detailed in a great deal in the Ending American Apartheid 2020 handout, as well as the Eisenhower handout. It goes in a great deal of detail. The American Apartheid also talks about what cities have done and can do to overcome these practices. But it's just so ingrained. Housing segregation is so ingrained in the American psyche that people think that is the norm and that is natural. And as Rothstein's book points out, my little monograph point out, it's anything but natural. It's the result of deliberate policies and laws.
And that's kind of, Dan, I mean, as planners are working in communities of color, because it's probably prevalent in, I'm guessing Latinx and possibly even Asian communities as well. Do you think this has some impact on, we're representing government agencies often. Do you think this has how people are receiving us and the work that we have to do to build trust in communities, knowing that these same agencies once led policies that were detrimental to these communities? Well, not even once, because it's still, in some cases, still happening. How do we kind of eradicate those kinds of relationships or rebuild them?
I think this reflects, I've long contended that Blacks in particular are underrepresented in the planning profession because it's a profession that has basically worked to screw them, pure and simple, through urban renewal and creating and maintaining segregation, exclusionary zoning, et cetera. So why do you go into a profession that has been working against you for so long? But my feeling about that is, if we're going to change the profession, we need more people, African Americans in particular, to go into the profession and work in, not just work in Black communities, but work in the white communities as well. I'll share this with you. Last night, the Chicago Bar Association gave us a virtual tour of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg exhibit at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And it was mind-boggling. But one of the things that really came across was how when she argued, they had the audio of her arguing some of her 6 cases before the US Supreme Court on women's rights. And it became extraordinarily clear that all those men on the Supreme Court didn't understand a thing about how women were treated, whether it was the workplace, the military, or in general, not a clue. And if you ever see this, try to control your anger when Justice William Rehnquist, one of the most conservative justices we've ever had, makes a remark to her that's beyond the pale in open court. And one or two of the other justices is just like mocking the equal rights movement. But they didn't understand what it's like. And she did a masterful job of explaining to them without getting angry, because her mom always told her, never get angry. Doesn't do any good. And she's right. Something I wish I had learned 30 years ago.
Me too.
That what it is for women in these situations and how these practices are discriminatory. And I think that's something we have to do with racial discrimination in this country too. I think there's a huge proportion of whites in this nation who just don't understand. They don't have a clue. They go beyond being racist. They go into pure out and out bigotry. And they've been unleashed. They've come out of the Kraken was unleashed for white supremacy in the last 4 years. So we've got a lot of work to do. Education is critical, but the big question is, and I don't know the answer, is how do we educate these people that are continuing to impose these barriers? Maybe one city at a time. I just don't know.
And Christine, I don't know if we have any questions from the audience, so I'll let you jump in with some of those.
Great. Well, first and foremost, again, I guess maybe this is for Bruce. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people said they want their family to view this documentary. They want to view it with their family. How are they able to get access to it? Because our recording, we have a recording of our conversation here, but the recording doesn't include the documentary. So is there a way for folks to get a hold of this, to view it with their family and have discussions at home?
Stalk him like I do.
We're doing private screenings. So this being one of the private screenings, and we have a number of them set up. So if they get in touch with me through you, or my email is bso3@duke.edu. I'll get them information about when some of these other private screenings take place, and they can just hop on to those.
There's one next week, I believe, from the Hope Fair Housing Center in Wheaton, Illinois, that's free. So if you Google Hope Fair Housing Center and get to their website, you can probably find a link where you can register for it.
Okay, there you go. There you
go. This question here, if someone wanted to research the contract buying impacts in their own city, where would they go to find that data?
Okay, that's a great question. We did a study, by the way, that was a companion to the documentary, and it took 10 college students, many of them graduate students, under the leadership of myself and some scholars from University of Illinois, Duke, and Roosevelt University. And we did a big deep dive into the Recorder of Deeds office to take a look at the land transactions during all this time period and the deeds. We also were very fortunate to, and that took months of painstaking house by house, research in neighborhoods that we knew underwent this racial transition during those years. We also there was a court case that was connected to this whole story, this contract buyers league story. And I didn't include it in the film because it would have just made it longer and more complicated. And I wanted to make these films short so that they can be used in school settings and what have you. But that lawsuit had a lot of data from the depositions of the contract sellers and the costs that they were charging people and the price of the home that they paid for it and so forth. And we had a lot of exact addresses through that we then, double checked with our research in the Recorder of Deeds office. So every state, city, I guess, has different requirements as to, what you have to file when you go through these land transactions. So everybody's going to be a little bit different, but yeah, there's ways to do it. And that's how we came up with, by the way, of that figure of $3.2 to $4 billion that we thought was the overcharge to Black families, or not even just an overcharge. And that's so conservative. We really erred on the conservative side because African Americans they weren't even able to take advantage of the interest deductions. They had no equity in their properties. We did not have records of how many people were foreclosed on. We know there were a lot of people foreclosed, but the Cook County and Chicago did not keep those records all the way back. And so the cost was even more. But there's ways to go at that. And again, if there's some serious efforts afoot in some other cities, be glad to talk to people and share what we did. Got a little pause here.
Time to call in the kids for some entertainment.
So while Christine's pulling that up, Dan, if you can kind of talk about some of the fair housing stuff you've led, not just here, because I'm assuming you're pretty engaged nationwide on kind of that kind of work that you've been engaged in.
Well, the most important, this isn't just me by any means, the most important thing that you can do in a jurisdiction to foster integration, which is what's required by community. If you get a community development block grant, you have the legal obligation to foster racial and economic integration. That's the whole purpose of the statute under which the CDBG was created back in 1974. If you don't believe me, just ask Walter Mondale, who sponsored it. He's still alive and he's still speaking out on this. But the key thing you can do is work to end the dual housing market. See, underlying everything is a dual housing market, one for blacks and one for whites and Asians pretty much, and pretty much Hispanics as well, but there's a separate one for blacks in general, and the two aren't allowed to meet. And they exist because of the steering both by real estate professionals and the self-steering that we do because we think this is the norm. Organizations like the Oak Park Regional Housing Center, which has celebrated its 40th or 50th anniversary now, and it's key to Oak Park, Illinois staying integrated, being one of the very few, there's maybe 5 stably integrated cities in Illinois out of 1,298 of them. What it does is it expands housing choice. So it gives listings of apartments. They deal largely with apartments, but also sometimes single family homes to blacks in the parts of Oak Park that have an inexplicable low percentage of blacks, so that they will look in those neighborhoods as well, besides the neighborhoods that have a higher black population. And they give listings to whites in the parts of Oak Park that have an unrealistically high percentage of blacks and unrealistically low percentage of whites. So they will look at those, and that's how you keep it integrated, by maintaining white demand. It's a regional housing center. It also does this work regionally. In every analysis of impediment to fair housing choice that we've done, we've recommended this as a key tool for the cities to use. And we know that Washington, D.C. staff and Fairfax County, Virginia staff, which is right next to D.C., are interested and would like to be able to do this. The problem is getting the political will from the elected officials to do it. But it's about expanding choice. When you should be making basically building into your zoning process, the social impact analysis or statement. And I admit, I've been pushing for this since the mid-1970s and largely getting hit on the head with a brick when I bring it up. But it should be identifying what a development effect it would have on the racial and economic composition of your community. And you should be requiring, to get planned unit development approval, of affirmative marketing, that they use advertising that shows people of all races. That makes a huge difference. Even maybe someone in a wheelchair. But they go out of their way to expand their market of who they're advertising to. There's a good experiment, it's recounted in the Indian American Apartheid, of I think it's in there also, it's in one of the AIs we did, of out in the Southern California area, a group started putting up billboards on the highways showing black people living in these communities that they were driving by that were virtually all white. And it resulted in an increase in black interest and black purchasing and moving into these communities. So there's all these tools you can use. There's a ton of them. A lot of them are in the American apartheid piece. A lot of them are in the final chapter of every AI we do. And if you want to see any of them, the website is planningcommunications.com. There's a button for analyses of impediments. You can't miss it. Skip the Naperville AI. That's the first one we did that created all the hubbub about changing the nature of AIs. The ones since then are so much more complete and so much better. But the final chapter gives you the guidelines, of practical guidelines that we as planners of what we can do to overcome the damage that we have been complicit in for decades.
Planners are really in a interesting, unique position to influence, I would think. So, you know, it would be incumbent upon those planners who are interested in this and want to see some change to really educate themselves around all these issues. And that, I think, is the first step, is all those things that you're talking about, Dan. But, you know, when we get to, you know, how do we create transformation? How do we create healing? How do we create repair, reconciliation? The first thing we have to do is we have to reckon with the truth. We have to know the truth, which is another reason why I think, you know, we're producing this series, just so we can make a contribution in that regard.
And this is something APA can help with. Every time I've been president of either APA or AICP, we've tried to set up a planner support function at APA to help planners that are trying to do the right thing, end exclusionary zoning, end segregation. And just 4 years ago, we had a perfect example with Amy Connolly in Tinley Park, Illinois, who helped shepherd through a low and moderate income housing development in Tinley Park. And Tinley Park is one of the suburbs in Chicago that exists solely so white people can live with only other white people. This is why I'm notorious. And she was shepherding it through. It got voted down. I've got a whole series of the newspaper articles how she got fired for doing her job properly. She got sued by the city for doing her job properly. The Department of Justice sued the city twice. They wound up consolidating the cases, and in the end, you know, she had a total exoneration. She didn't do anything wrong. She did what she was supposed to do. The city had to pay out big, but the development never got built, and Tinley Park is still lily white. But I think as an organization, and maybe Angela, you could bring this up, but don't use my name. We did get it established once in 2002 when I was president of AICP, and I was a stupid idiot and said, let's do it with APA. And the APA president stonewalled us for 3 years and we never got to do anything. So maybe, you know, you could lead us to the good fight.
I walked right into that one, Christine. I walked right into that.
You got to understand, the planning profession has been very resistant to dealing and addressing with integration. It's been very resistant to social impact analysis. And, you know, when I went to work for ASPO, American Society of Planning Officials, a predecessor to APA and AIP, I was hired for the Planning Advisory Service. The first report I wanted to do was on how to integrate communities and create stable, racially integrated communities. And they just laughed at me. They thought it was hilarious. Nobody cares about that. Nobody wants integrated communities. I wound up doing exclusionary zoning instead, which I guess eventually led to me going to law school. So I can blame them for that.
I guess it's almost time to wrap up, but Christine, I'm guessing you have some.
Yeah, I have a few. And by the way, I just got a message that Amy is on the line. Actually, she's listening in today. Hey, I'm on the call today.
We use her story so often, so it's great she's here.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, this was great. I wish it wasn't time to end because there are so many great questions and I'm just soaking in all of this information. This is wonderful. We are recording this portion of the presentation and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel. If you're unable to download the 2 handouts, just email us at info@ohioplanning.org and I can get those 2 handouts for you. And be sure to head over to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, to register for our future webcasts. Hopefully we'll have you guys back for another round. Bruce, you have anything else?
He Bruce definitely has, but before that, just
I have a closing
Yeah.
closing ask. Close the deal here. We have a survey. It's a very simple survey that I think Angela will just distribute the link, or somehow get out the link to you if we can do that, Christine. And it just asks for people's reactions to the film, and if they want to be kept in touch with all the other work that we're going to be doing. So it'll be a good way. We're gonna let people know more about what books they could read and articles they can read and other films they can see that will help further educate themselves on the subject. So please fill out the survey form and return it to us. Yeah.
And also, for those of you who are interested in topics like this, the APA Housing and Community Development Division does look to do more programming. If you have any ideas, please contact us. And worst case, you can always contact me. I might be the easiest to find, but our chair, Brian Laughlin, is very receptive. So we are looking to do more programming. So very thank you to Rachel Smith, who's spearheading our webinar process this year, and Angela Self, who is our VP and she's our vice chair. So the two of them have been really making sure we have great programming, because we want to make sure we're providing housing and community development programming within APA. So thank you so much, APA Ohio, for hosting us. You guys are awesome.
Thank you all. This was really great. And I will send out that survey. I think I have the link to it, so I'll send it to all the attendees.
Cool.
And we can go
And
from there.
HCD is here again next week, right, Christine?
Yes. Hold on, let me see what we got here. Yeah, actually, I'm really excited about this one too. It's resilience in vulnerable communities, and I believe this is the one where we're going to talk about the gullahs down
Yes.
in the Carolinas. I'm really excited about that.
My classmate Sharice Grant, she is the historic preservation planner for the city of Hilton Head, South Carolina. So I'll be here. I'm excited.
Fabulous. Wonderful. And being from Ohio, we go to Hilton Head every year because that's what you do in Ohio, is you go down to Hilton Head or Myrtle Beach. So
yes. Well, thank you both,
right.
Dan and Bruce.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care.
You too.